I would like to talk about salience bias and the hero complex among social scientists in academia. Because I think there's some very unintended consequences to the way we go about choosing research topics and studying research topics that is causing some problems between groups in the US. And I think there's actually a much better way of approaching social science research that could get us out of this trap. And I'm a social scientist myself. I'm an economist, and I'm very interested in other types of social science. I'm a liberal arts person where I like to talk to people across differences. I've learned a ton from other social scientists, anthropologists, social workers, political scientists. I love learning across disciplines. So I'm not against these people, but I do think we as a group have some biases that we need to attend to. Now, here's the gist of my argument. It's basically that when you look at any particular group of people, whether it's a professional group like professors or construction workers or lawyers, or whether it's a racial group or an ethnic group or a religious group, whatever group you're looking at, those groups are going to be super complex. They're going to have tendencies that are different from the regular population on average, and some of those tendencies are going to be positive and beneficial to the world, and other tendencies are going to be negative. So my basic argument here is what oftentimes happens is that academics pick a problem, a world problem that they're trying to solve. And that's a good thing for them to be actually using their research to solve problems. But they frame that problem in a way such that some groups are mainly viewed as victims, other groups are mainly viewed as perpetrators, and almost always the hero is either the academic or policymakers or other people who sort of go in the social circles of the academic. And what this means is the academic doesn't pay enough attention to the victim's traits where the victim group could actually be the heroes, and where the perpetrator group could actually be the heroes too, because the hero role is sort of taken up by groups that are considered us by the academics. So I think a way of fixing this would be to, when you're sort of focusing on different traits of groups, looking in every single group you study, whether they are more the perpetrator or more the victim in the particular circumstance you study, giving way more salience to the traits that are unique to each of those groups or more common in each of those groups that could fill the hero role in societal problems. I think that's the solution. Now I want to go into a little bit more detail about what I think is going on here. So there was this cartoon I saw online like 10 years ago, and I couldn't find it, so I recreated it. But this is basically the cartoon. So you go to grad school, there's this body of knowledge in the world, and your job as a graduate student is to increase the body of knowledge in the world by a little bit. And to do that, you kind of zoom in on one boundary of the knowledge. You learn that boundary really well by exploring the literature that exists. And you do something, you write a paper to bump out the knowledge. So we know a little bit more as a species when you graduate as a graduate student than before you entered. That's the process. Now, the cartoon was making the point that we tend to zoom in to only think about our little piece of the world, our little piece of knowledge that we are working on. And we forget that there's this entire other body of knowledge that all matters just as much. Like, we are not the most important part of the body of knowledge. So the cartoon ended by saying, don't forget the big picture, and I think that's important for academics to remember. It's also worth noting that when you're in a department that also studies that one little section of the body of knowledge. You're surrounded by these people, so everybody's focused on the same thing. And so it can be really hard to zoom back and think about the big picture when there's social salience to that one tiny little piece of the puzzle. And of course, this plays out in terms of academics thinking that their body of knowledge is more important than everybody else's body of knowledge because everyone in their social circle thinks so. And it becomes this reinforcing feedback loop sort of thing where the end group is basically elevated and the importance of the end group research is elevated. And I want to point out that I actually do not think that's necessarily a bad thing. Like, I would way prefer a group of engineers that studies how to make bridges safer, to really think that's the most important decision in the world, to constantly be thinking about that problem. I think that's way healthier than if that group of engineers constantly zoomed back and constantly thought about the problems of the world in the order that they deserve attention. Like, maybe climate change is more important than solving the bridge problem. Like, maybe inequality and climate change and liberal democracies, maybe some of those bigger problems are actually more important than the problem of fixing bridges. But I would still rather my engineers spend way more of their time thinking about fixing bridges. And I'm okay with it if those engineers think that they are super important for fixing those bridges, because that's what we actually need them to do. So that's just me telling you, I don't think it's bad that we exist in social circles that sort of reinforce the self-importance of our field. Not necessarily bad. Where it can go wrong is when you have social scientists who look at a particular problem and characterize certain groups as the problem, other groups as the victim, and the academics and the policymakers as the heroes. And there's a couple of reasons why that's a problem. And one of them is that actually everybody wants to contribute positively to the world, and they want their group to contribute positively to the world. So when you pigeonhole them in this one role that may have some truth to it, in fact, may have a lot of truth to it, you are not paying attention to the other traits in that group that are part of the solution to something in the world. You're sort of elevating one trait of the group that might be something that's true on average, even though it's less true of the whole group. Maybe just this group has a 12% tendency to that instead of a 8% tendency. So that group is more prone to that behavior. But that doesn't mean that behavior characterizes the entire group and what they have to offer. And the problem here is that both of those groups, the group that is only characterized as victim or way overemphasize their victim status, and the group that is mainly characterized as perpetrator, both of those groups may experience those characterizations as contempt. My definition of contempt is that it's an attitude of disgust arising from long-standing negative thoughts about a group or person being morally inferior, intellectually inferior, or beneath consideration. So usually when you're focusing on the perpetrator group, that group is going to be characterized as morally inferior. When you're focused on the victim group, that group is going to be characterized as either intellectually inferior or lacking in agency in some way where they don't have what it takes to solve their problems. And there may be some truth to that, and a lot of truth that group doesn't have the tools they need to fully address the problem. But they may have a lot to offer in other realms where they are the source of heroship. So moving to the topic of salience, salience is basically how big is a particular fact or set of understandings or facts in your worldview. And like I mentioned before, I love it that how to fix a bridge properly is a huge part of engineers' worldviews. I just love that. That's how it should be. But when your worldview is sort of your worldview about certain groups and about the traits they have on average to offer the world, if a trait of that group that is not necessarily positive gets outsized in your worldview, that's going to influence how you treat them, how well you protect their rights. And the fact that academics are training future leaders who will be the ones in charge of protecting people's rights, listening to people's grievances, addressing people's grievances. If the people who are going to embody those leadership roles have views of groups that are distorted, that don't fully tap into the wonderful things every group has to offer the world, that's going to cause problems between the elites and the people that they're serving. So I do think social scientists have a duty to make sure that we're thinking about groups in ways that highlight both the perhaps negative traits of those groups, including victim traits, and also the positive things those groups have to offer.